Looks like we are filling up, and I'm going to make a start now. So hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for this Natural History Live webinar, In Between the Cracks, Getting to Know Our Wild Urban Plants. I will now hand over to Dr. Bethan Stagg.
Thank you, Ellen. So I'm going to start with a Mentimeter poll, which I'm about to share, which is, the question is, how many plant species do you think you'd see if you walk to your local shop? So if you go to mentee.com and then use the code 85330204, or you can use the QR code to enter there. So we've got a few entries coming in now. So between 15 and 30 is the majority so far, but there's a few thinking that they'd see more than 30. That's now in the lead. Very interesting. So quite a lot of people that would see more than 30, and just a few that would see less than 15. But it looks like most people would think they'd see between 15 and 30 or more than 30. So that's really great. So thank you for responding to that. That's really interesting. And now I'm going to share my presentation. So hopefully you can see the presentation now. And thank you so much for sharing on the Mentimeter there. So I'll just say, before I start, I'll just say something about my research. So I explore learning and perceptions about wild plants and invertebrates. I'm a research fellow at the University of Exeter. And partly why I'm so interested in wild plants and invertebrates is I've been a lifelong botanist. And I'm also very interested in the less popular biodiversity, you know, the kind of what we tend to call the less charismatic biodiversity, although I think it's perfectly charismatic, especially as these are often the most accessible forms of nature in urban areas. A lot of my research is about addressing plant blindness, which is the low interest and awareness about plants, which has been kind of researched in urban areas. And if you're interested in finding out more, you'll find my publications, my academic publications on Google Scholar, or also on my university profile page that's listed there. So I walked to the co-op from my house, which Google Maps tells me is a distance of just 320 meters. So I've got quite a short trip to my local shop. And I counted the number of wild plant species I found, and I found 41 different plant species, wild plant species. So I was in that more than 30 category. And I'm going to tell you about some of those species that I saw on my walk to the co-op. So the first plant that I see when I come out of my front door is annual meadow grass growing in the cracks in our paving slabs. And this is probably not surprising, as it's the most common grass species in the world. It's a short-lived grass species that flowers all year round, and each plant can produce thousands of seeds, which can remain viable in the soil for several years. The seeds provide food for many bird species, including finches and sparrows, as well as voles and mice. Also between the paving slabs was a good example of one of the first plants to colonize bare rock, known as a bryophyte or a moss, probably cypress-leaved plat moss. Mosses have rhizoids instead of roots, small hair-like structures which grip onto the bare rock, and these soak up moisture and minerals from rainwater through their highly absorbent surfaces, which is why so many mosses are like spongy cushions. Now that's fine when it's raining, of course, but what about when this hard surface is baking in the sun? Fortunately, mosses also have an ability to go into a state of dormancy in these conditions, and some mosses have even been known to survive temperature highs of 100 degrees Celsius. Many of the species in built-up areas are what we call pioneer species, plants that are adapted to colonize exposed rock, for example, as you get after a landslide or from the soil erosion after severe flooding. And this process is known as ecological succession. Mosses and lichens also release complex acids, which can actually dissolve the rock they're growing on. And that's a process known as biological weathering. So this will actually start to break down the rock, and this process releases mineral ions that they will then use for their nutrition, as well as starting to break down the rock surface. As they die and decay, the organic matter mixes with the rock particles and starts to form soil, paving the way, if you excuse the pun, for the first flowering plants to come along. And one example, just outside my front gate, on the tarmac of the road, is this tiny, tough perennial plant, Pearlwart, originally a coastal plant. It looks quite similar to a moss, growing in these little clumps to help protect it from drying out or being trampled on. But if you look closely, you can see its tiny flowers. And this species is so hardy, it's even established in the Antarctic, where it's proven to be very invasive. Also on the pavements outside my house, growing in this young rudimentary soil, was a young willow herb plant from left to right, pineapple weed plant, and common field speedwell. Now, both the willow herbs and the speedwells are quite difficult to identify, so here are some guides here on the screen to help you with those. And a key character with speedwells are the shape of the fruit, which the author of this guide charmingly calls hairy bum fruits. And this is the shape of the hairy bum fruit in common field speedwell. So I'm sure that's something that you won't forget from today. Pineapple weed is a classic ruderal species, meaning it tends to grow in frequently disturbed ground, such as flower beds, wastelands, bare places by paths. Pineapple weed originates from Northeast Asia and apparently escaped from Kew Gardens into the wild in 1871 to become one of the fastest spreading introduced plant species in the UK. Ruderal species are adapted to life on disturbed ground by having very short life cycles, typically 6 weeks from germination to seed production, and they also produce huge quantities of seed. I've just noticed there's a few people that are looking for the link, so please rest assured that we will share those as we go and at the end, so you will get all those links to access. These ruderal plants are rapidly outcompeted by larger or longer lived plants if the soil disturbance stops happening. So the minute that the soil stops getting dug up, such as in your flower or vegetable beds, or getting disturbed on wasteland, then other plants will move in. But these ruderal plants are really good at that early stage. Ruderal plants are often self-pollinating, and that means they can flower and reproduce all year round, even if insects are not available. I saw quite a few other ruderal plants on my journey to the co-op. So this plant here is Wavy bittercress, which was also growing in the paving slabs in my garden. And it has these slender seed pods known as siliques. And when these seed pods ripen, they split and catapult the seeds as far as 16 feet from the mother plant. Botanists call this mechanism ballicory, which means ballistic seed dispersal. So they can go really far. Wavy bittercress, which is the one shown here, is almost identical to hairy bittercress. The main difference is that wavy bittercress has 6 stamens. That's the male organ of the flower that produces the pollen, whilst hairy bittercress has 4. So wavy bittercress 6 stamens, hairy bittercress 4 stamens. And I'll show you another picture of hairy bittercress. At least I will if my mouse will behave itself. There we go. So here it is again, and this time you can see the flowers in this lovely lush plant of bittercress growing outside our charity shop. This plant is in the Brassica family, the Brassicaceae, and is edible in the early stages. So it's actually a really lovely tasty kind of mustardy plant that's well worth trying. Another, yes, that's a good point. Classic dog pea zone there. So don't go for that one. Always go above what's called the splash zone, which is about 20, 30 centimeters from the ground if you're harvesting anything. Groundsel is another classic ruderal plant I saw, which probably recognise as it's so unusual looking. And like pineapple weed, this is in the Asteraceae or daisy family. And the flower heads lack the white ray florets. That's the white petals that are found in daisy. So it's these really quite strange looking flowers, although actually they're composite flowers, which means each of these flowers is made up of hundreds of what are called little disc florets. So it's a composite flower. The seeds are produced in the form of a miniature dandelion clock, like shown, and groundsel produces about 1,200 seeds per plant. No, ragwort is actually a different species, but you're right, they do look quite similar, and they're both very attractive to the cinnabar moth. Now, groundsel has at least 2 generations of groundsel a year, which is very common for ruderal plants. Sometimes they'll have even 4 generations a year, and that means one plant could potentially gives rise to over 1 million individuals. So it's not surprising that some people don't welcome this one in their garden. Outside the co-op, I saw another ruderal plant species, shepherd's purse, growing in the cracks in the pavement. And this plant has these wonderful heart-shaped seed capsules. The seeds within have a far more astonishing property, however. They exhibit a kind of carnivory, proto-carnivory, which means kind of primitive carnivory, an adaptation to growing in the nutrient-poor soil. And there really aren't many examples of seeds that are carnivorous. That really is quite astonishing. When the seeds start to germinate in the soil, they produce a lethal mucus that attracts nematodes, these tiny roundworms shown here in the photograph that live in the soil. It attracts them and then kills them. And the nutrients from the decaying nematodes result in better germination and growth, as this study shown on the slide managed to find out. I also saw this very curious plant, sun spurge, which has a more benign strategy for getting its seeds off to a good start. This is the tiny female flower and the gland, this heart-shaped, star-shaped structure, which secretes nectar to attract pollinating insects such as flies. Flies are actually really important pollinators, by the way. After bees, they're the most important pollinators. The pollen from the male flowers, which you can't see in this photograph, unfortunately, they release the pollen. It's then brushed against the body of the fly and transferred to the next flower. After the female flower is fertilized, this ovary, shown here as a kind of round structure, swells to being much more spherical to produce 3 seeds. And this is an electron micrograph of the seed, so a really close-up image here of this tiny seed, probably just a couple of millimeters in diameter. And it has this fleshy, oil-rich attachment called the elaiosome. So that's this structure that's tinted orange in the micrograph at the top of the seed. And ants will carry the seed to their nest and feed this lysosome, which is very oil rich and calorific, to their developing larvae. However, the seed coat is too hard for an ant to crack, so the seeds are left near the nest where they can germinate far away from the original plant and in good quality soil. It's really important with sun spurge not to touch the sap of this plant, which is this milky latex, as it's a skin irritant and can really make your skin kind of burn a little and feel quite itchy. And in fact, the entire plant is poisonous to stop any animals trying to eat it. And amazingly, the sap also contains compounds that can stop other species germinating nearby. So it's got quite an armory there to protect itself. One of the most interesting parts of my short journey to the co-op is the railway bridge that I have to cross. And railways are a haven for wild and exotic species. At the bottom of this photograph, you can see these dainty daisy-like flowers, which are called Mexican fleabane, an introduced species that thrives in crevices. And then you can see the more familiar common sow thistle, this tall plant at the back. And this is called sow thistle because pigs like to consume it, basically. So it's very attractive pig fodder. It's also part of a traditional food for humans. It's eaten by the Maori people in New Zealand and was traditionally cooked with spaghetti and meatballs in Italy. And again, sow thistles reduce a kind of milky latex when you break the stem, which true thistles don't. So that's a really good way of telling the sow thistles apart from the true thistles, by breaking the stem and seeing if you get to milky latex. This latex, by the way, is quite harmless, not surprisingly, as it's edible. These gland-tipped hairs on the flower buds produce essential oils, which are believed to protect against insect and bacteria that could attack the plant. So another strategy here for defending the plant against herbivory. I also saw a very common perennial en route, dandelion, shown here growing with the grass Yorkshire Fog, which is this lovely, soft, furry grass. And if you pull the Yorkshire Fog up, it has little pink stripes at the base of the grass stem, which I remember the way I was taught was that they're like a Yorkshireman's pink pajamas. I'm sure Yorkshiremen don't all wear pink pajamas, but that was a way that I learnt of remembering how to identify it. Dandelion is another latex producing plant. And again, the latex protects the plant against insect herbivores. Amazingly, this latex from dandelion can also be turned into rubber, and Russian dandelion is being grown commercially for use in tire manufacture. So, and it was really important in Russia in the Second World War for as a source for rubber production. And you can find out more from this little video, which again we will share with you either now or at the end. As well as ruderals, we also find a lot of lithophytes in cities. This comes from the Greek word litho, meaning rock, and the word phyte, meaning plant. And it describes plants that are adapted to grow in or on rock. Lithophytes are very common in built-up areas, as the walls and paving slabs mimic their natural habitats of cliffs or scree. They tend to be very tolerant of high calcium levels, which is found in mortar. Mortar is very rich in calcium, very lime rich. And they form associations with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, these fungi that you might have heard of with this expression, the wood wide net, which inhabit the root tissue of the plant and increase the uptake of nutrients and water for the plant, basically mainly by increasing the surface area. I was lucky enough to see 3 wall ferns on my journey, and we're lucky that the wall ferns are very common in the southwest where I live. On the left we have wallrue, and on the right we have maidenhair spleenwort, which I see one of our participants also has a lot of in their area. Growing out of this hollow PVC windowsill outside our old fish and chip shop was this tiny polypody fern. And this fern is normally an epiphyte, meaning it grows on other plants, usually trees. And I suspect what has happened here is this kind of hollow sill, PVC windowsill, which is filled up with moss, is kind of mimicking a moss-filled tree crevice, which is what's allowing this polypody to thrive here. I saw a couple of lithophytes that are flowering plants as well. So this is a tiny plant of navelwort growing in the kind of debris around a drain pipe. It should be nice and moist, I expect. And the name refers to the dimple in the center of this disc-shaped leaf, which looks a bit like a navel. It's a succulent, which means it has fleshy leaves that can store water. And like many succulents, it has a special type of photosynthesis, which is called crassulation acid metabolism, which conserves water in times of drought. That's also shortened to CAM photosynthesis. And this lovely flower, ivy-leaved toad flax, which is so called because its leaves are ivy-shaped, has these tiny mauve flowers, which are like a miniature snapdragon. And my son always says that these flowers are like tiny mouths when you squeeze them. It's said that this plant was brought to London with imported marble slabs from Italy in 1640, another calcium lover. You can see in this photograph its long flowering tendrils travelling across the wall. Once the flowers are pollinated, however, the stalk starts to curve back towards the shade of the wall, and this that enables the seeds to be pushed into the dark, damp crevices of the wall where they can germinate. So that's a very clever strategy to help persist on walls. And some walls you would just see them absolutely covered with this. And here it is growing again in the air vent of the butcher's shop. So a more unusual place to find this tough, resilient little plant. So all the plants that we've talked about so far are herbaceous plants, plants that don't have woody tissue. But I did also see 3 trees and shrubs on my short journey, and these represent a much later stage in ecological succession. So they would normally appear a longer time after disturbance, after the pioneers have come in, and then the herbaceous perennials, and now you've got nice, much richer soil, and that's when you'd start to get the woody plants coming in. I saw some sycamore seedlings, I saw 1 willow sapling, and then this buddleia growing in the leaf litter that had accumulated, been blown there by the wind, I guess, behind this broadband box. Buddleia arrived in the UK from China around the 1890s, and it thrives in urban landscapes, as I'm sure you're familiar, particularly during the Second World War, because these places mimic Buddleia's natural home of rocky mountaintops and dry shingle. You probably also know it as a butterfly bush because red admiral, peacock and small tortoiseshell butterflies all flock to its purple flowers. It's really important to point out that the nectar sources of the flower, however, are only helpful if we provide food sources for the caterpillars too, and nettles are actually a great caterpillar food source for those 3 butterfly species. So a good excuse to not kind of tidy away the nettles in urban places, as it kind of combines well with buddleia to support our butterflies. I know that's the point that Bob Flowerdew always makes when people talk about butterfly bush. So the roots of these larger plants have the ability to force open cracks in concrete and tarmac. And this is due to something called Turgor pressure, the force exerted by the liquid contents of a cell against the cell wall. So you've got all these cells in the root full of liquid, and pushing against, that liquid is pushing against the cell membranes and cell walls. A growing root cell's Turgor pressure can be up to 0.6 megapascals, which is over 3 times that of a car tyre. So you can imagine that's a considerable force that's being exerted. And that explains how this sizable willow here in the photograph has managed to thrive on this derelict sports court. I should add that this is the one plant I didn't see on the way to the shop. This one's actually a few miles from where I live. So that's an introduction to 15 or so of the 41 species that I saw on my walk to my local shop. So just to recap on some of those species, we saw, don't know how well you can see that, but we saw annual meadow grass, sorry, common pineapple plant, common sow thistle. I'm just going from left to right at the top here. Common polypody, and then in the second row, ivy-leaved toadflax, pearlwort, navelwort, and groundsel. And then on the final row, we've got the Mexican fleabane, the walrue, the maidenhair spleenwort, the sun spurge, and the shepherd's purse. So what I'd like to do now is jump to another mentee, and I'm sorry I didn't spend very long on the mentee poll at the beginning, so we'll have a look at that one again as well for those that have added to it since then. And our next mentee poll is on the question, which methods do you use to identify wild plants? So I'm going to jump now back to mentee. So hopefully you can now see our mentee poll there. So this was the one that we had at the beginning. How many wild plant species do you think you'd see if you walked to your local shop? So the winner there is more than 30. So it sounds like the majority of people like me would see more than 30 species on the way to the shop, and that's an incredible amount of diversity, isn't it? That's incredible that there's that much plant diversity between us and our local shop in I'm sure a lot of you live in built up areas as well. So our next poll, which of these methods do you use to identify wild plants? So this is the code 85330204 again, and there's the QR code there. And we can see there we've got people using a range of methods. So we've got auto recognition apps, identification apps, field studies, council guides, identification books, websites or social media, and other methods. And it's looking like people are using really quite a kind of impressive variety of different resources there. So that's really nice to see. So it looks like identification books are in the lead. And I'm really not surprised to hear that, actually, because I think even though we have a lot of electronic options now, identification books are still incredibly valuable. And actually, this was something we looked at in a couple of our academic studies. And we found that these resources perform really well alongside the electronic resources. So they're still really important. So thank you very much for sharing that with me. And I'm now going to switch back to the PowerPoint. So hopefully you're able to see the PowerPoint again. And so we had quite a lot of people there that are using these auto recognition apps. So these are mobile apps where you point the app, the phone, at a plant, and it will attempt to identify the plant automatically. So these are becoming increasingly popular and are very accessible for beginners. They're becoming quite popular with teachers as well. But how accurate are they? So lots of positives, but actually how accurate are they with the ID? So this is what 3 botanists set out to find out and published the results a month ago in the open access journal PLOS ONE. So you can read that paper if you want to find out more. And they put 6 auto recognition apps to the test: Google Lens, iNaturalist, LeafSnap, PlantNet, PlantSap and Seek, and they tested these 6 apps on 38 wild herbaceous plants. They found that all of the 6 apps were better able to identify flowers than leaves, and that PlantNet and LeafSnap were the best performing apps. But even those had a maximum accuracy of 88%, and the other apps were considerably below this. I quite agree. Somebody's just put in the chat that for some people, actually just having a vague answer, getting some pointers is really helpful. So that's the kind of take-home message for this, really, is they are really helpful, but they're best used in combination with another resource. So they're good for kind of getting you started on the track of identification when you're feeling a bit daunted and by the bewildering number of plant families, but they're much better combined with another resource to get accuracy, because it is quite important to accurately identify plant species, particularly say if you're getting into wild food foraging, then it is incredibly important. So and just to improve our ecological literacy, it's really great to kind of get quite an accurate result. So which other methods should we use then? So not surprisingly, I'm going to mention the FSC guides here, not just because this is an FSC talk and I used to work for them, but because they are invaluable for beginners and as introductions to new habitats. So each fold-out guide, the laminated fold-out guides, cover a specific habitat or category. So this is the one for neutral grasslands. And once you've built your confidence, you can progress on to the Aid Gap series, such as this guide to grasses, also published by the Field Studies Council. And these are incredibly valuable for beginners of all ages and more experience. As you get more experience, they're very popular with schools and are just a great way for building expertise. I'm also a big fan of building reference collections. It's a method I've used a lot when I've been teaching ecology, where we will literally just tape some plants to a white tray when we're in the field as a kind of memory jogger when we're doing vegetation surveys, to just kind of remember and not to have to keep going back to the ID key. You can also press plants and build your own reference collections, and I found this incredibly useful for learning grasses and ferns in the past. They're both groups of plants that press well, are quite hard to identify initially, but as soon as you've got that reference collection, every time you see a grass, you can kind of compare it to your collection and say, okay, is that one I've got already or a new one? But you're quite right, there are some rarer plants we shouldn't pick to press, so this is very much just one to use with common plants. You can also keep a nature journal and draw and write about the plants you see, and this is another approach that we investigated in one of our studies, this approach of using descriptive writing and drawing about wild plants. And the great thing about journals is they're very creative, and also you don't need to have much technical knowledge because you can just come up with your own descriptive terms as you're starting to kind of get to grips with the botanical terminology, which can be very daunting when you start. We've used a variety of methods with children as well as adults for both increasing interest in plants and learning to recognise them. These include leaf rubbing for familiarisation with the leaf shapes and margins of different species. And this works particularly well for ferns or tree leaves, those leaves that are a bit more robust, because the more fragile leaves just won't make a good rubbing. Also, painting around margins is a lovely activity for children. That again is a fun, creative activity, but also you're starting to familiarise yourself with the leaf shapes. And these are some summer tree leaves. Another lovely approach, again, I've used a lot with children, but also adults, is pressing specimens into clay. So this works really well for seed pods, fruits, and seed capsules in autumn, as a kind of really lovely tactile way of learning recognition, some of those different textures and shapes. I've also experimented a lot with hedgerow basketry. This is something I've used a lot in my educational workshops in the past. And there's more than 30 common woody plants and climbers that can be used for weaving. So it's just incredible, really, how many different wild plants can be used in crafts. And another craft that is really lovely to experiment with is textile dyeing. And we can use some really common plants for this that give good colours, such as oak twigs. In fact, any tree twigs really give a lovely pinky colour, like that second flag from the left. And also plants like docks and nettles, and also buddleia. Buddleia, surprisingly, gives this bright yellow colour, not the kind of purple that you might expect from the colour of the flowers. A more unusual approach that we explored in a couple of studies was the use of mnemonics. These are visual memos that link something about the plant's appearance with its name. And these are some mnemonics that our learners came up with. So for lords and ladies, which has these arrow-shaped leaves, these leaves are pointed arrows that the lords fire to impress the ladies. So linking something about the shape or appearance of the plant with its name. So that brings us to the end of the talk. So we're going to move on to questions in a moment. We've looked at a number of common urban plants with interesting adaptations. And it just shows how much plant diversity there can be in urban places. And I think that poll, that mentee poll, really demonstrated that, where we had most people actually saying that they'd see more than 30 plants just on the way, wild plants just on the way to the shop. We've also looked at some different approaches for learning botany, such as apps, journals, and press plant collections, and about the importance of not relying too heavily on auto-recognition apps, but trying to use them in combination with other approaches. And then some approaches there for engagement, like the pressing into clay, and leaf rubbings and crafts. If you'd like to hear about our future events and resources, then I do welcome you to join our mailing list. We're currently working on an open access course about connecting children and young people with plants, aimed at teachers, other educational practitioners, and just any interested individuals, basically. So if you want to find out about that, do join our mailing list. That will be free of charge, by the way. And so thank you so much for listening, and we will drop these links into the chat. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and we'll see what questions you have.
Thank you so much, Bethan. That was an amazing presentation. I certainly learned a lot. We've had a few questions come through to the chat already, and actually Cameron has just sent one, which I think would be a lovely one to start with, which is, what is your favourite urban plant to find?
Oh, lovely. That would be very hard to narrow down, actually. I think the favourite where I live, which isn't a very typical urban plant, but is one I absolutely love, is catsia, which has a lovely, very cheery dandelion-like flower. And also has an incredible hairs on the leaves, definitely one to look at with a hand lens. And that covers my lawn. Also my lawn is a lovely species called fox and cubs, another dandelion family member, which has these lovely kind of bright orange flowers. So I'd probably say those are my two favourites where I live.
Amazing. We have had another, this question is possibly a little bit ID specific, but it would be lovely to hear your thoughts on it. Earlier in the talk, Alyssa asked how we would distinguish sun spurge from petty spurge. Not sure if you know.
That's a good question. They are quite hard to tell apart. Petty spurge is much smaller, and it doesn't have the kind of umbrella shape that the small spurge has a very kind of umbrella shaped flower head, where petty spurge tends to just have about 4 branches to its flower head. So that's the main ways to tell those apart.
Amazing. Hopefully that answer helps, Alyssa. Moving on to the next question. Pauline has asked, what plants should we encourage and any we should discourage in our gardens for wildlife? Pretty big question. And there's a second part, which is about working with councils to stop pesticide use in urban areas.
I thought that would come up, though. Those are both very interesting questions. So in terms of which plants we should encourage, I mean, obviously we have some well-known invasive species, which fortunately are fairly unlikely to turn up in your garden. They tend to be associated with watercourses. So most of the species that pop up in your garden are to be welcomed if you want them there, basically. So I always think it's kind of up to people to work out what they will and won't live with to a certain extent. So groundsel, with its potential to reproduce itself to 1 million individuals, might be one that you aren't so enthusiastic about. Yeah, any others, and really just about having as much diversity, and those that are less common are really good. And you're quite right, Debbie, dandelions are absolutely incredible for pollinators, not just bees but also beetles. Really rely on dandelion, and there's quite a number of caterpillar species that consume the leaves. So very common plants can be really good for biodiversity too, but if you do get any unusual ones, they're to be kind of encouraged as well. And then we had a second question there. Oh, actually, just to add actually on that subject, the ones for pollinators that tend to be best tend to be the very open flowered ones, and as a general rule, the dandelion family, the Asteraceae, do tend to be very good for pollinators, less so than, for example, the Brassicaceae, the mustard and cabbagey type species. However, that family tends to be really, really good as caterpillar food. So I always urge people, don't just focus on pollinators. Remember what I was saying about butterfly bush. Remember the caterpillars too, and all the other insects that aren't pollinators are incredibly important. Yeah, I do get a bit concerned when we just see a kind of bias to pollinators. And then our second question was around councils. Now, this is a very tricky issue because plants growing on pavements and in cracks and so on are damaging the hard surfaces, and these do cost a lot of money to maintain and replace. So obviously I would love them all to be there and not be killed, but there is a maintenance issue there. I mean, basically so remember I said at the beginning, there's the biological weathering. You've got lots of plants that are releasing acids from the roots and starting to corrode the hard surface, and then once you're into the bigger plants, then you've got them starting to push cracks apart. So it's kind of important to kind of see both sides, and what I always say is focus on verges, focus on those areas that aren't a hard surface, because you're much more likely to get traction there with the council. So verges, absolutely no reason why they should be mown, no excuse for it at all. And actually we've got a lot of councils coming around to that, because of course it also saves money. So I'm delighted to say that our councils in my region, Plymouth and Exeter, now leave all their verges unmown, which is a great result, and that's a really good thing to focus on. But obviously the pavement plants are really lovely, and the wall plants, and it's great if we can keep those too.
Fantastic answers there. Thank you, Bethan. Interesting question that's come through to the chat in the last couple of minutes is, in the drought last year, lots of pavement weeds stayed green. Why do you think that was?
That's a really excellent observation, and that was something I noticed too. And I really noticed during COVID as well, how our street was kind of moving from the early successional stages you kind of pretty much to late succession, because they just the plants weren't getting sprayed. So that was really amazing to see. So they've got a few different ways of staying nice and green in drought. They've got different adaptations. So one is that some species will have hairy leaves, and that's a way of just conserving moisture during drought. You've got these relationships with these fungi, these beneficial fungi called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, that allows the plant to access more moisture in its tiny little crack or peep of leaf mold. And then you've got the fact that a lot of them are very short-lived. So they're actually, as soon as it starts to get droughty, they just speed on, throw out all their seeds, and then a couple of weeks later, sometimes even days later, the next generation is germinating and coming along. So a few different strategies there.
Thank you. And next question from Ian in the chat. Have there been any studies on the value of these isolated urban plants for pollinators or wildlife? And Ian's added, I mean, individual ones, not like a lawn full of dandelions, but more like one toad flax plant on a wall.
Oh, interesting. So these isolated plants, there's been a lot of studies about pollinator dynamics. In fact, that's what I did my master's dissertation on many years ago in ecology. And what we find with pollinators is it's the density of flowers that's more important than the size of the patch. So, for example, you might have I've seen some verges along roundabouts where you'll have these incredibly dense clumps of bird's foot trefoil, and they might only be kind of 50 centimeters wide, but they're kind of just basically solid with flowers. And that kind of resource a bee, particularly a bumblebee, would travel a long way for, because the cost to them is actually commuting between is traveling from flower to flower. So their commute, as it were, their kind of daily commute doesn't cost very much energy, but moving from flower to flower does cost a lot of energy. So that's why they like those dense patches, and they'll travel a long way for those lovely little patches of bird's foot trefoil and toad flax, if they're nicely densely distributed.
Lovely, thank you. Another great question is, what advice would you give for a beginner trying to move from being able to identify, say, 12 common plants, moving on to the many, many others?
Well, I really love the Little Gem Wildflower Guide for that kind of intermediate step. And I think that's a really good point, because there's a lot of resources for kind of getting you started. But as you say, once you get past the kind of first 15 or so, I mean, I know a lot of resources, including a video that we're working on for our online course, focus on the top 20. So we've got a video about the kind of top 20 that you're most likely to see in development. And once you get beyond that, it's like, okay, where do I go now? And I love a Little Gem guide. I think that's a really good place to go next. And then to move on to some of those guides like Rose and Riley that I showed you there in the in fact I forgot to mention that, but I showed a picture of Rose and Riley, which is the guide that I have always used a lot. And just not to be too daunted, spend a bit of time just flicking through. Don't be some of the keys are quite hard to use, but just flicking through is absolutely fine too. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that, and just kind of starting to build recognition. And it's actually that what's called holistic recognition that's really valuable. And that's one problem with keys, is they distract us from the whole appearance of the plant and gets us focusing on just little components of it. And there's been some really interesting studies by a guy in the States, Bruce Kirchhoff, about how we recognize plants like we recognize faces. This is this process of holistic recognition. And people say, oh, plants all look the same. They don't, of course. And actually a lot of faces do look quite similar, and yet we recognize those perfectly easily. So that's quite interesting, is to think about approaches where you're looking at the whole plant and kind of immersing yourself yourself in an experience looking at the whole plant rather than getting too bogged down by you know, where its hairs are and the length of the hairs and that kind of thing. But both are important. Yes, that's right, holistic recognition, you've got that right, Sam.
Amazing. We have a couple of questions linking back towards managing the types of plants that would be growing in pavements and gardens. So a couple of people have asked for advice about controlling weeds, particularly nettles and brambles, without using weed killers.
Right. I mean, I with these perennial weeds, where they have rhizomes, these underground roots that can just produce little plantlets. That's what's so challenging. It's really important to dig all those up. So I've had a lot of allotments in the past, and some of those have been kind of absolutely covered with brambles and nettles when I've taken them on. And my approach has tended to put down a woven polythene membrane. I know polythene's not great, but I mean, mine's now about more than 10 years old, my polythene, so it's good if you buy the expensive stuff. Put that down for a few months to start, so they start dying back, and that will start to loosen up the soil and loosen the rhizomes, all those fat white roots. And then it's just digging basically and just pulling them all out, pulling out all those white rhizomes, and just clearing the area. And actually, as soon as you start cultivating an area, then those perennials tend to kind of stop persisting after a while, actually, and then you get into the ruderal species. So you have nettles and brambles to start with, and then a year later you'll find they've gone, but you'll have groundsel and all those ruderal species I showed you.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, I've been working through those stages as a recent allotment holder myself, and can gonna take that optimism for next year. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. So we had an interesting one earlier on about railways, which I'd like to come back to. So somebody asked, why are railways a haven for wild and exotic species?
Yes, that's a really good question. It's basically because they're a continuous corridor of undisturbed ground. So whereas a lot of wasteland or kind of places where wild plants can establish are kind of broken up, you know, they're just little patches, a mosaic within our city. The railway is just this corridor, this kind of highway, as it were, for plants to establish undisturbed. And they also offer a variety of micro habitats. So you've got the tracks and you've got the gravel that mimic those shingle habitats I was saying about, where you get some of the lithophytes, and then you've got the verges and the embankments, where you've got sometimes high quality grassland interspersed with patches of scrub. So you've got quite a few options for plants to colonize, and then they've got a great way of moving around the city. And then you've got the other factor, which is probably less important now, but in the past was really important, is you've got a dispersal method on the train itself. So on the train, seeds can catch and get carried somewhere else, and that's why you get those kind of exotic species that you won't see elsewhere. And you often get the same with ports. Anywhere else that you've got, you know, boats or transport coming from far away is where you're going to get interesting plants coming in. So that's why in Plymouth, for example, we have the Plymouth pear. We have our own endemic pear species, and that's all part of that rich maritime history.
Another brilliant answer. Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have time for today. Bethan, were there any last tips or thoughts you wanted to?
I just wanted to mention, as a few people have said, it's really great to join a amateur naturalist society as a way of building your knowledge. So Botanical Society, the British Isles, or the Wildflower Society are both, and Plant Life are great too, are really great organisations to join to learn more and meet other amateur botanists.